the fall of 1988, the town of Fairview, Illinois, was the kind of place where life moved slowly, where people recognized one another on the street, and where the highlight of a weekend was the glowing marquee of the Grandview Theater. The theater had stood on Main Street for over half a century, its Art Deco sign flickering above the sidewalk, promising escape into stories larger than life. By then, the paint on the walls had faded, the velvet seats were worn, and the smell of popcorn clung permanently to the air. But for teenagers in Fairview, the Grandview was still magic. It was the place you went when you were restless, when you wanted to feel part of something beyond the edges of a quiet town. On Friday, November 18th, three friends, 16-year-old Mark Ellison, 15-year-old Brian Kelly, and 14-year-old Dana Harper, headed toward the Grandview for what was advertised as the theater's last late-night showing before renovations. The plan was simple: catch a horror double feature, grab burgers at the diner afterward, and talk about how they'd seen it all before. To anyone watching, it was just three kids being kids, walking under the flickering street lights, their laughter cutting through the crisp November air. Witnesses remembered them vividly. An elderly couple said they passed by on their way out of the theater's earlier show and saw the group heading inside. The ticket taker, a man named Robert Hughes, who had worked the booth for decades, would later testify that he sold them 3 tickets. He remembered Mark joking about sneaking sodas past the concession stand. He remembered Donna adjusting her denim jacket, glancing nervously at the posters for the horror films, but following her friends inside anyway. He remembered everything, except ever seeing them leave. The film began at 9 o'clock. Patrons described a half-empty theater, a handful of high school students scattered through the seats, a few older couples near the back, and the usual hum of the projector rattling from the booth upstairs. The Grandview was the kind of place where ushers rarely patrolled, and most of the audience slipped out without anyone noticing. By midnight, when the credits rolled on the final feature, the crowd shuffled out into the chilly night. Robert Hughes collected tickets, locked up the booth, and eventually pulled down the metal grate across the lobby doors. The street emptied, the neon sign buzzed, and the theater fell silent. But the 3 teenagers never came home. The first alarm came the next morning, when Mark's father went to wake him and found his bed empty. His friend's parents were making similar calls, each assuming at first that the kids had stayed over at someone else's house. By noon, panic set in. None of them had returned. None of them had called. Their rooms were untouched, their belongings exactly as they had left them. Police questioned Robert Hughes that same day. He insisted he saw them enter. He remembered tearing their stubs, hearing them laugh as they pushed through the lobby doors. But when pressed, he admitted he hadn't seen them leave. It was busy, he explained. People go out different doors. Sometimes kids sneak around. But I don't recall them coming back through. His testimony was both credible and chilling. Detectives scoured the theater. They searched every aisle, every row of seats, every restroom. They combed the projection booth and the storage rooms. Nothing. No soda cups with their names, no jackets left behind. It was as if the 3 friends had stepped into the darkness and dissolved into it. Fairview was not a town accustomed to mysteries. By evening, search parties had formed, scouring alleys, parking lots, and nearby woods. Flyers with the teenagers' faces appeared in shop windows. Police set up roadblocks, questioning drivers, asking if anyone had seen a group of 3 walking home. No one had. Then the stories began to ripple. Some patrons claimed they noticed the kids move toward the front rows during the second film and never saw them again. Others said they spotted them lingering near the concession stand during intermission. A few swore they saw the glow of flashlights behind the screen, though none could explain how or why. The Grandview itself began to feel less like a theater and more like the last place anyone had seen them alive. Rumors spread that the building had a maze of maintenance corridors, hidden stairwells, and storage rooms long since abandoned. Old employees whispered that during the theater's golden age in the 1930s, architects had built hidden compartments behind the stage and screen for equipment no one used anymore. Most of it had been sealed off decades earlier, but in a building as old as the Grandview, nothing was ever truly forgotten. Police searched again, this time with dogs, but came up empty. The dogs grew restless near the screen, barking at the curtains, but handlers found nothing behind them, only a blank wall. The lead detective admitted quietly to reporters that the situation made no sense. 3 teenagers had entered a theater in front of dozens of witnesses, yet no one, not one person, could confirm seeing them leave. By the end of the week, the Grandview's marquee no longer promised movies. It promised only questions. Parents clung to hope, while whispers of darker possibilities crept through town. And as the doors of the theater were locked once more, the silence that filled the building felt heavier than the echoes of any film reel. Fairview in the late 1980s was the kind of town people often drove past without noticing. A scattering of houses, a diner with neon lights that hummed all night, a gas station that doubled as a gossip hub, and one main street where nearly everything happened. For decades, the heart of that street had been the Grandview Theater. It wasn't just a place to watch films, it was a landmark, a meeting point, a rite of passage. Every generation in Fairview had stories about the Grandview. First dates, Saturday matinees, children clutching candy in sticky hands. By the 80s, it had aged into something both beloved and unsettling. The carpets were frayed, the curtains smelled faintly of mildew, and the projectors rattled like tired machines. But for teenagers looking for somewhere to go, it was still magic. The 3 who vanished that night had grown up with the theater as part of their lives. Mark Ellison was 16, tall for his age, with dark hair that always fell into his eyes. Teachers called him bright but restless, the kind of kid who doodled guitars in the margins of math homework. He dreamed of starting a band and leaving Fairview, though he rarely admitted it out loud. Friends described him as the leader of their trio, quick to joke, quick to get into trouble, but always the first to defend the other 2 if anyone pushed them around. Brian Kelly, 15, was different. He was quieter, more observant, a boy who carried a sketchbook everywhere and filled it with drawings of buildings and machines. He had an eye for detail, which made him invaluable when the group snuck into places they weren't supposed to. Abandoned barns, half-finished construction sites, even the projection booth at the Grandview once. While Mark was bold, Brian was careful. Together, they balanced one another. And then there was Dana Harper. At 14, she was the youngest, but in many ways the sharpest. Teachers remembered her as thoughtful, with a streak of stubbornness that made her stand out. She loved horror movies, despite pretending to be afraid so the boys would tease her. She often carried a small Polaroid camera, snapping pictures of their adventures, though most of those photos were never developed. Friends said she had a way of grounding Mark and Brian when their schemes grew too reckless. The 3 had been inseparable for years, bound together by the restlessness that comes from growing up in a small town with too few distractions. On weekends, they rode their bikes through back roads, shared fries at the diner, and spent hours under the buzzing lights of the arcade near Main Street. The Grandview was their gathering place, the one spot that seemed to belong to them. Sneaking into late-night horror features felt like rebellion, even though everyone in town knew the ticket taker never really cared. But the Grandview was more than just a theater. Its history stretched back to 1932, when it opened during the golden age of cinema. Built in the Art Deco style, it had marble columns in the lobby, velvet drapes framing the screen, and a balcony where the wealthier families once sat. Over time, the shine faded. By the 70s, the balcony was closed off, the marble chipped, and the drapes heavy with dust. Old employees whispered that the building had been designed with strange features, Maintenance tunnels, sealed-off storage rooms, even a hidden stairwell behind the stage. Some claimed there had once been dressing rooms from a brief period when the theater also hosted live performances, but no one could prove it. Rumors about the Grandview had circulated for years. Teenagers dared each other to sneak behind the curtains, insisting there were doors hidden in the walls. Others said the basement had been used for storage during Prohibition, when bootleggers needed places to hide shipments. The most persistent story was that there were rooms no one had entered in decades, rooms that weren't marked on any blueprint. Most dismissed these tales as small-town exaggerations, but they gave the theater an edge of unease, the sense that it held more secrets than it should. For Mark, Brian, and Dana, those rumors were part of the thrill. They had talked more than once about sneaking behind the screen, daring each other to prove the legends true. In the weeks before their disappearance, classmates recalled Mark bragging that he knew a way into the restricted areas. He had even sketched a crude map of the building's layout in the margins of a notebook. Whether he was serious or only trying to impress his friends was never clear. The night of November 18th had seemed ordinary at first. Posters for a horror double feature were taped to the windows. One a slasher about a haunted summer camp. The other an older film from the 70s that still drew fans. It wasn't unusual for teenagers to attend those shows, laughing at the gore, pretending not to be scared. The difference was that for Mark, Brian, and Dana, it was supposed to be one of their last adventures before the theater closed for renovations. They told friends at school they planned to explore the building afterward, to finally see if the legends about hidden passages were real. That detail would haunt the investigation later. Parents insisted their children had gone only to watch movies. Classmates whispered otherwise, that the trio had been planning to slip behind the screen. The truth was never confirmed, but it gave weight to the idea that the Grandview held secrets capable of swallowing them whole. Fairview struggled to accept the loss. The town had endured storms, factory closures, the slow decline of Main Street, but never something like this. 3 young lives, full of plans and futures, gone without explanation. Their absence reshaped the town's identity, turning the Grandview from a place of memories into a monument of fear. The theater itself loomed larger than ever in the story. Its flickering neon, once comforting, became ominous. Parents forbade their children from going near it. Rumors thickened that employees knew more than they admitted, that the owner had covered up structural dangers, that the building itself was cursed. Every creak of its beams, every whisper of wind through its cracked windows seemed to echo the question no one could answer. How could 3 kids walk into a theater and never walk out? By the time the investigation quieted, the Grandview was more legend than landmark. It stood dark most nights, its future uncertain, its reputation stained. For the families of Mark, Brian, and Dana, the unanswered questions became unbearable. For the rest of Fairview, the theater became a reminder of how quickly the ordinary could turn into the unexplainable. And in the decades that followed, the Grandview waited. Dust settling, seats empty, screen blank, holding on to its secrets until the day they would finally be uncovered. The first 24 hours after Mark, Brian, and Dana failed to come home were filled with denial. Parents called one another, convinced the kids had decided at the last minute to spend the night together. By morning, when every phone call ended with the same hollow answer, "No, they're not here," the fear began to set in. Fairview was a small town. Teenagers might skip curfew, but they always showed up sooner or later. By noon on Saturday, it was clear something was terribly wrong. Police began their investigation with the obvious, retracing the children's last known steps. Witnesses were consistent. The trio had entered the Grandview Theater around 9 o'clock Friday night for the late show. They laughed, joked, and handed over their tickets to Robert Hughes, the aging ticket taker who had worked at the booth longer than most of the kids had been alive. He remembered tearing their stubs, remembered Dana tugging her jacket tighter against the cold, remembered Mark teasing Brian about sneaking snacks past the concession stand. He remembered everything, except ever seeing them walk out. That single fact hung over the investigation from the start. In a theater filled with 24 other patrons, no one could recall the three leaving. The usher had no memory of them during cleanup. The concession stand attendant remembered them buying popcorn, but couldn't say what happened after. Every detail pointed to the same inexplicable conclusion. They had entered, but they hadn't exited. Detectives scoured the building. They searched every aisle, every row of seats, every bathroom stall. They climbed to the projection booth, examined the storage closets, and even forced open the locked balcony doors that had been closed for years. Nothing. The building was empty, silent, ordinary. No clothing, no bags, no scraps of evidence to suggest the three teenagers had been there at all, apart from the ticket stubs Hughes had torn and dropped into the box by his feet. Parents gathered outside the theater, refusing to leave until answers came. Mark's father paced the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on the marquee, as if staring long enough might force it to give something back. Dana's brother snapped at officers, demanding they tear the walls apart brick by brick if that's what it took. Reporters began to arrive by evening, drawn by the unsettling simplicity of the story. 3 teenagers in, no teenagers out. Theories surfaced immediately. Some speculated the trio had slipped out a side exit, but detectives checked them all. Every emergency door was sealed from the inside, covered in layers of dust that would have shifted if touched. Others suggested they might have snuck into the basement or attic. Police checked both. The basement contained only moldering boxes of old posters and reels of film. The attic was empty, its beams sagging beneath years of neglect. What unsettled investigators most were the whispers about the building itself. Old employees told stories of hidden rooms, forgotten passages behind the screen, maintenance tunnels that had been bricked up when renovations cut costs decades earlier. Some swore the original blueprints showed stairwells that no longer appeared on modern diagrams. Whether those spaces still existed was unclear, but the possibility gnawed at the investigation. Dogs were brought in on the second day. Handlers walked them through the aisles, their nails clicking against the sticky floors. Near the screen, the dogs grew restless, barking and whining. But when officers pulled back the curtains, they found nothing but plaster. No door. No hollow sound when they knocked. Just a wall that seemed too solid, too final. Still, the dogs refused to settle, pacing, growling, as though something beyond the wall disturbed them. By the end of the weekend, panic had spread across Fairview. Flyers were printed with school portraits of the 3 friends. Volunteers taped them to shop windows and telephone poles. Search parties combed the town's edges, trudging through fields and creek beds, calling their names until their voices cracked. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across farmland. Nothing surfaced. The Grandview itself became a monument of dread. Its neon sign buzzed weakly above the sidewalk, casting a sickly glow onto the pavement. People avoided walking past it, crossing to the other side of the street. Inside, the silence pressed against the walls like a weight. For the families, the theater was no longer a place of laughter and movies. It was the last place their children had been seen alive. Detectives admitted quietly to one another that the case defied logic. Every path they followed ended in the same impossible fact. 3 teenagers had walked into the Grandview Theater, and in the eyes of the town, they had never walked out again. By the 3rd day of searching, Fairview no longer felt like the same town. The quiet streets, usually dotted with children on bicycles, and the hum of passing pickups, had taken on a tense stillness. People spoke in whispers at the diner, stared too long at strangers, and eyed the Grandview Theater as if the building itself were responsible. Patrol cars circled the block through the night, their headlights sweeping across the faded marquee that still bore the letters from Friday's double feature. The investigation widened. Detectives canvassed every business on Main Street. The diner across the road reported nothing unusual, just the usual crowd of teenagers drinking milkshakes until closing time. The bar on the corner said the same, though a patron claimed he saw 3 kids run past just before midnight. When pressed, he admitted he'd been drinking and couldn't be sure. Police checked the statement against the theater's timeline. The doors had been locked before midnight. The account didn't fit. Officers began interviewing classmates. Friends recalled how Mark had boasted about exploring the Grandview's restricted areas. Some admitted he had drawn maps, though no one had seen them clearly. One student swore he heard Mark mention a door behind the screen. Another claimed Brian had once described hearing noises during a movie, footsteps that didn't match the sound from the speakers. None of it added up to evidence, but it painted a picture the detectives couldn't ignore. The 3 might have tried to explore parts of the building no one else used. The theater's owner, Harold Bennett, bristled at the implication. He told police there were no secret rooms, no hidden passages. The building, he insisted, was old, but ordinary. Yet when pressed about the blueprints, he hesitated. Records from the 1930s were incomplete, scattered across county archives. Renovations had sealed off certain areas, but Bennett could not say exactly which. His uncertainty fueled the rumors. Reporters swarmed Fairview. Television vans lined the street outside the theater. Microphones, shoved into the faces of grieving parents, broadcast their pleas across the state. "If anyone saw anything at all, please come forward," begged Brian's mother. Mark's father told cameras he believed the children were still alive somewhere. Dana's brother grew angry at the sight of journalists, accusing them of turning his sister's disappearance into spectacle. Inside the investigation room at the police station, detectives mapped every theory on a whiteboard. One suggested abduction. Perhaps someone lured the teens into a restricted area and trapped them there. Another insisted they had run away, though nothing in their lives pointed to it. They had left wallets, clothes, and unfinished homework in their rooms. They had told friends they'd meet for burgers after the film. No one runs away in the middle of buying popcorn. Leads from outside the theater trickled in, but each ended in disappointment. A farmer claimed he saw headlights near his property late that night. Deputies checked and found nothing. A gas station attendant reported 3 kids matching the description buying sodas at 1 a.m. The surveillance tape was too grainy to confirm, and the timestamps didn't line up. Each tip raised hope, then collapsed under scrutiny. The most unnerving lead came from within the theater itself. Maintenance staff admitted there were areas they avoided. The storage rooms in the basement where the air smelled of mold. The stairwell behind the screen that had been bolted shut for decades. Police demanded access. Bennett reluctantly produced keys that squealed in the locks. The stairwell led only to a wall of bricks, mortar crumbling with age. The storage rooms contained only rusted reels and collapsed shelving. Yet one officer swore he felt a draft of cold air, as if something lay beyond the wall. Dogs were brought in again. Once more, they barked furiously near the screen, pawing at the floor until handlers pulled them back. The plaster was struck with hammers, tested with drills, but no hollow cavity revealed itself. Reporters latched onto the story. Dogs detect something behind theater screen. But the next day's follow-up deflated the excitement. No discovery, no breakthrough. Just a blank wall and more questions. Meanwhile, the families unraveled. Parents lingered outside the theater long after search crews left, their faces pale in the glow of the neon sign. At vigils held in the school gymnasium, classmates clutched candles and photos of their friends, their voices trembling as they sang hymns. Teachers cried in the back row. Donna's camera, left in her bedroom, became a symbol when her mother displayed it on the podium. "She loved taking pictures," she whispered. "She should be here with us." Weeks slipped into months. Snow fell across Fairview, blanketing the sidewalks, muting the noise of traffic. The Grandview remained locked, its doors chained, its future uncertain. Detectives filed their reports, each page repeating the same haunting fact. The 3 teenagers were last seen entering the building. After that, nothing. By the start of the new year, the case had already begun to harden into legend. For investigators, it was an unsolved file gathering dust. For families, it was a wound that never closed. And for the rest of the town, it was a story whispered in diners and school hallways, a story that would come to define Fairview itself. By spring of 1989, the case of the 3 missing teenagers had already begun to drift into the uneasy space between tragedy and legend. Officially, the police investigation remained open, but behind closed doors, officers admitted they had exhausted every lead. The Grandview Theater stood dark and silent, its marquee empty, its windows collecting dust. People walked past quickly, avoiding the sight, as if the building itself were guilty. Rumors, however, did not rest. They grew louder with each passing month. Some insisted the 3 had been kidnapped by a drifter passing through town. Others swore the theater contained secret tunnels that police refused to open. Students at the high school dared each other to sneak inside, to look for doors that didn't appear on the blueprints. A janitor claimed he once heard footsteps echoing in the balcony long after the building had been closed. When he went to check, the seats were empty. The families lived in a state of suspended grief. Every knock at the door jolted their hearts. Every phone call after midnight felt like it might carry news. Mark's father left the porch light on for months, unable to admit it no longer mattered. Brian's mother set a place for him at the dinner table, her hands trembling as she carried the plates. Dana's brother carried her Polaroid camera in his backpack, showing classmates the last picture she'd taken, the 3 of them grinning on their bikes. He swore he would never forgive the town for letting her vanish without answers. Detectives tried to keep momentum alive. They circulated sketches of possible suspects. Men reported hanging around Main Street that night. They chased false sightings in nearby counties. Each tip collapsed into nothing. Over time, fewer officers attended the weekly case briefings. Notes grew shorter. The file thickened with reports that repeated the same lines. Entered Grandview Theater. Not seen exiting. The physical evidence was non-existent. The ticket stubs, the popcorn bags, the empty soda cups, none could be tied definitively to the 3. Their belongings remained in their bedrooms, homework unfinished, cassette tapes stacked neatly by stereos, winter coats hanging in closets. They had taken nothing with them. It was as if the theater had consumed them whole, leaving no trace for investigators to follow. In the absence of facts, the town began to invent its own truths. Some whispered that the trio had staged their disappearance, that they had planned it all along. The theory crumbled under scrutiny. Why abandon families, futures, everything they knew? Others suggested darker possibilities, that someone who knew the theater well had used its hidden spaces to trap them, that the walls themselves concealed evidence no one dared uncover. The Grandview's reputation hardened into menace. Parents forbade their children from even walking past it. On stormy nights, some swore the neon sign flickered to life by itself, casting an eerie glow across the empty street. Teenagers spread stories that, if you pressed your ear to the back wall of the auditorium, you could hear faint voices. Most dismissed it as superstition, but the stories stuck. Reporters returned on anniversaries, their cameras capturing weeping families and empty sidewalks. Headlines spoke of mystery, not progress. National outlets called it the theater that swallowed 3. The label stung, but it fit the way Fairview felt. A building once filled with laughter had become a tomb with no graves. As the first anniversary approached, a vigil was held on the steps of the high school. Students lit candles, their flames trembling in the wind. Teachers read aloud letters the teenagers had written for class assignments about their dreams for the future. Silence followed, broken only by sobs. Parents stood together, hollow-eyed, clutching photographs that seemed frozen in time. The town gathered, but no comfort came. The case was not officially declared cold until the following summer, when detectives moved resources to newer crimes. For the families, the announcement felt like betrayal. For the town, it felt like inevitability. The Grandview remained locked, chained and untouched, looming like a scar at the center of Main Street. And yet, behind its closed doors, dust gathered on velvet seats, reels of film decayed in forgotten closets, and somewhere in its bones, the truth waited. A truth no one would uncover for more than 3 decades. By the early 1990s, the case of the 3 missing teenagers had slipped from urgent crisis into a lingering wound. The police file was still open, but weeks had become months. Months had become years, and no new evidence had emerged. The Grandview Theater remained chained shut, its once flickering sign dark, its windows layered with grime. The building stood like a mausoleum in the center of Fairview, too large to ignore and too heavy with unanswered questions to touch. The town struggled with the silence. Parents of other children grew cautious, enforcing curfews that were rarely challenged. Teenagers whispered about the theater in hushed tones, daring one another to press their faces to the dusty glass doors and peek inside. Most never did. The legend of the Grandview grew with every retelling. The idea that 3 young lives could vanish so completely inside a building filled with people was too much to accept, so people invented their own explanations. Rumors divided into 2 categories. Some clung to practical theories, that the teenagers had been abducted by someone who knew the theater well, perhaps a projectionist or a janitor who used hidden spaces to trap them. Others insisted the 3 had run away, though the absence of money, belongings, or preparation made that theory collapse under scrutiny. Then there were the darker whispers, the ones that spread fastest in the absence of fact, that the Grandview itself was cursed, that the walls hid something monstrous, that the theater had become a place where the ordinary laws of the world no longer applied. Reporters came and went. On anniversaries, they returned with cameras and notebooks, pressing grieving families for quotes. Mark's father refused to speak, his jaw tight, his eyes on the ground. Brian's mother often broke down mid-sentence, begging for answers she knew would never come. Dana's brother grew sharper, angrier, glaring into cameras as he accused the police of giving up too soon. Each year, the coverage ended the same way, with shots of the theater's locked doors, its dark windows staring back at the town like blind eyes. The police tried to maintain an image of activity. Files were updated with tips that led nowhere. Sightings of 3 kids in neighboring towns, rumors of runaways in distant states. Each proved false. Leads collapsed almost as quickly as they appeared. By 1993, detectives admitted privately that unless the theater was demolished, there was little more they could do. Without access to whatever might lie behind its sealed walls, the case was like chasing smoke. But demolition never came. The building's owner, Harold Bennett, refused to sell. He argued that the structure was still sound, that it could be reopened someday. Families protested, begging for a full search, but the county balked at the cost. The Grandview remained locked, its secrets sealed within. Fairview itself began to change under the weight of the unsolved mystery. Businesses along Main Street struggled, their customers unsettled by the shadow of the theater. The diner lost its late-night crowds. The arcade, once filled with laughter, went dark within a year. Even the high school felt different. Teachers noticed an edge of paranoia among students, as if the disappearance of Mark, Brian, and Donna had shattered their sense of safety. What had once been a carefree town now carried an undercurrent of fear. For the families, the years brought only harder grief. At first, they left the children's bedrooms untouched, as if waiting for their return. Posters remained taped to windows long after the paper curled and yellowed. By the mid-1990s, reality pressed heavier. Beds were stripped, toys boxed away, belongings packed into storage. But the photographs remained, smiling faces frozen in time, reminders of futures cut short. By the end of the decade, the case was spoken of less in public, but more in whispers. Children who had been classmates grew up, moved away, and told the story of the Grandview like a campfire tale. "I knew them," they would say. "They went into the theater, and they never came back." The Grandview stood, its silence deepening, its legend hardening. A building once meant to entertain had become the physical embodiment of absence. Every storm that rattled its windows, every bird that perched on its cracked sign, seemed to echo the same unspoken truth. The mystery was not solved. It was simply waiting. By the late 1990s, the disappearance of the three teenagers had become a story with a life of its own. For the families, the pain was raw. But for the wider town, the case had shifted into folklore. Children whispered it to each other on playgrounds. Teenagers dared each other to sneak up to the theater's chained doors at night and knock, claiming you could hear faint knocking back. Adults avoided the subject altogether, their silence louder than words. The Grandview Theater loomed in the center of Fairview like a wound that refused to heal. Its marquee, once lit with the names of films, was blank. Weeds sprouted in the cracks of the sidewalk below it. Pigeons nested in the faded Art Deco sign, their droppings streaking down the facade. Yet the building still stood, year after year, untouched by progress, as if time itself had frozen around it. Reporters returned on the 10th anniversary. By then, the case had become a regional curiosity, featured in true crime magazines and late-night television specials. One segment interviewed former employees who spoke about strange drafts in the building and unexplored storage areas. Another suggested the theater had once been connected to the old Prohibition tunnels rumored to run beneath Fairview. None of it could be proven, but each broadcast reignited speculation. The families endured these anniversaries with a grim rhythm. They gave interviews, lit candles at vigils, and held on to fading hope that someday the truth would surface. Mark's father grew more withdrawn, his hair turning gray before his time. Brian's mother moved away for several years, unable to bear the constant reminder, but returned eventually, saying she couldn't abandon the town where her son had last been seen. Dana's brother, by then in college, wrote articles accusing the police of negligence, calling for the theater to be demolished brick by brick. His voice carried online, where forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries picked up the case and dissected it endlessly. On those forums, theories multiplied. Some argued the children had been abducted and hidden within the theater itself. Others insisted they had stumbled into a hidden chamber behind the screen, a place no one else had been able to access. The most chilling theory suggested they had been locked inside intentionally, trapped by someone who had knowledge of the building's secrets. Each theory found believers. Each also had holes. Fairview lived under the shadow of those whispers. Teenagers grew up with the story as part of their identity, a warning woven into their childhoods. Some left town as soon as they could, convinced Fairview was cursed. Others stayed, treating the Grandview as a grim landmark. It was common for people to say, when giving directions, "Turn left at the old theater, the one where those kids disappeared." The building had become the town's defining feature, not for what it offered, but for what it had taken away. By the early 2000s, technology brought a new wave of attention. Online message boards, later true crime podcasts, retold the story to audiences far beyond Illinois. The phrase, "the theater that swallowed three," became shorthand for an unsolved mystery that defied logic. Amateur sleuths drew maps of the building, analyzed old news footage, and speculated about secret rooms. Some even traveled to Fairview, standing outside the chain doors, taking photographs as if the building were a monument. Inside the town, patience thinned. Business owners complained that the legend scared off outsiders. Residents resented the gawkers who treated their tragedy like entertainment. Yet no one could deny the pull of the mystery. Even those who rolled their eyes at the theories admitted, late at night, that something about the case still unsettled them. The Grandview remained locked, but its silence was louder than ever. When storms blew through, rattling its loose windows, people swore they heard voices inside. When children walked home from school and glanced at its facade, they quickened their steps. The building was not just abandoned. It was alive with questions that no one could answer. And beneath that silence lay a truth that still waited, hidden, untouched, pressing against the walls like a secret begging to be uncovered. By the mid-2000s, Fairview had settled into an uneasy coexistence with the story that defined it. New families moved in, drawn by cheap housing, only to learn the shadow that hung over Main Street. Outsiders asked casually about the theater, and locals responded with a practiced mixture of silence and discomfort. The Grandview was no longer just a building. It was a scar, and everyone in Fairview carried it. The police file remained technically open, but stagnant. Detectives retired, younger officers took over, and the case shifted from an active investigation into a box of reports, gathering dust in the evidence room. Every few years, a new detective tried to breathe life into it, reviewing witness statements, walking through the empty aisles of the Grandview, but each time they reached the same impasse. The building revealed nothing, and the years eroded what little hope remained. Meanwhile, legends deepened. Children told stories of the three teenagers wandering the aisles as shadows, visible only when the projector light flickered. Others said if you stood near the chain doors long enough, you'd hear faint laughter, abruptly cut off. Teenagers dared one another to sneak inside through broken windows, but none succeeded. The theater's walls, sealed tight, kept its silence. In 2008, the 20th anniversary drew a wave of renewed attention. National outlets covered it, casting the story in tones of gothic mystery. Families of the missing stood before cameras once more, older, wearier, but no less broken. Mark's father spoke haltingly, his voice shaking as he admitted, "We don't expect miracles anymore. We just want to know what happened." Dana's brother, now a journalist himself, wrote a searing op-ed demanding the theater be torn down. If answers are buried in those walls, then every day it stands is another day of cruelty. Still, nothing happened. The building's owner insisted it was unsafe to demolish without funding. The county balked at the cost, and so the theater stood, locked and empty, year after year. Online communities kept the case alive. Podcasts featured it as one of the most baffling American cold cases. Message boards speculated endlessly. Some pointed to reports of cold drafts in the building, suggesting hidden passages. Others believed the trio had been victims of foul play, their bodies concealed within the walls. A few insisted the case had a supernatural explanation, that the Grandview itself had consumed them. For the families, the attention was a double-edged sword. It kept the story alive, but it also reopened wounds with every anniversary, every headline, every stranger dissecting their loss. Brian's mother once told a reporter, "They've turned it into a ghost story. But for us, it's not a story. It's our children." Fairview itself declined further. Businesses closed, storefronts sat vacant, and the town gained an unwelcome reputation as a place haunted by its past. Teenagers grew up under the shadow of the Grandview, and many left as soon as they could, carrying the story with them to new places. Yet no matter how far they went, the memory of the theater lingered. By 2010, the building had deteriorated badly. The roof sagged, windows shattered, weeds clawed through the foundation. And still it stood, untouched, its silence heavier with every passing year. People avoided its block entirely. Children crossing town took longer routes to stay clear of it. At night, even the bravest refused to linger under its looming shadow. The mystery had not been solved. It had calcified into legend, an inseparable part of Fairview's identity. The Grandview was not just abandoned, it was a monument to the inexplicable. And beneath its cracked facade, in the dust and dark, the truth waited. A truth no one yet dared to uncover, though whispers said someday someone would. And when they did, the silence would finally break. By 2019, the Grandview Theater had stood silent for more than 3 decades. Its facade was a husk, its windows broken, its roof caving inward from years of neglect. Weeds split the pavement along Main Street, climbing the building's foundation like claws. For many in Fairview, the structure had become invisible, something they avoided looking at altogether. For others, it was still a presence that could not be ignored, looming like a monument to grief. That year, change finally came. Developers purchased several lots along Main Street, with plans to clear the block and build affordable housing. For Fairview, it was a chance to breathe new life into a downtown that had decayed since the 1980s. For the families of the missing teenagers, it was something else. The last opportunity to confront the building that had haunted them for decades. Demolition was scheduled for August. Weeks before, chain-link fencing encircled the theater. Warning signs were posted, equipment lined the street, and crews in hard hats began stripping away what remained of the interior. For many residents, watching the work was surreal. They stood at the barricades, silent, as excavators clawed at the walls of the building where their children had once walked. The families were there too. Dana's brother, now in his 40s, stood with arms folded, eyes fixed on the marquee. Mark's father, frail but unyielding, leaned against a cane, refusing to look away. Brian's mother clutched a photograph of her son in both hands. Reporters gathered quickly, sensing that history might be about to shift. The first days of demolition revealed nothing unusual. Workers hauled out rusted seats, decayed curtains, and reels of film fused together by mold. The projector was removed, its lenses cracked and useless. The roof collapsed under the weight of machinery. Dust coated everything, choking the air until it shimmered in the sunlight. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Grandview would be reduced to rubble without offering any answers. Then, on the 5th day, something shifted. Crews had begun dismantling the auditorium, tearing down the walls around the massive screen. As the fabric sagged and fell, one worker shouted for the machines to stop. Behind the torn curtain, where everyone had expected only plaster, there was a wall that did not appear on any blueprint. It was concrete, smooth, and strangely seamless, with faint lines that suggested a door once existed, but had been sealed over. Workers struck it with hammers, the sound echoing deeper than a solid wall should. A hollow resonance. The site supervisor ordered the area cordoned off. Within hours, police arrived. By evening, the block was flooded with floodlights and reporters. Fairview held its breath. For decades, rumors had circled about hidden spaces behind the screen, about passages bricked up during renovations. Now, for the first time, there was proof. A concealed chamber, a space no one had acknowledged for 31 years. The families watched from behind the barricades, faces pale in the harsh white light. Dana's brother whispered to a reporter, "This is it. This is where they've been all along." Mark's father didn't speak at all. his hands clenched so tightly around his cane that his knuckles turned white. Investigators worked through the night, carefully dismantling the wall. Dust fell in clouds as drills chipped at concrete. Finally, by dawn, the outline of a sealed doorway emerged. The hinges were visible, rusted, but intact. The handle was fused in place, buried under layers of concrete that had hardened like stone. Whoever sealed the chamber had done it deliberately. When the last chunk of concrete was pried away, the doorway stood revealed. Investigators hesitated, cameras flashing all around them. A crowbar forced the handle. The door groaned, and stale air rushed out, carrying the smell of damp earth, rust, and something older, heavier. Flashlights pierced the darkness inside, and what they revealed would forever rewrite Fairview's story. The beam of flashlights cut through layers of dust that swirled like smoke, drifting from the chamber that had been sealed for decades. At first, all that could be seen were bare concrete walls, lined with streaks of moisture. The floor was covered in debris, chunks of plaster, scraps of wood, and the slow creep of mold that had thrived in the stagnant air. The silence inside was suffocating, broken only by the shuffle of boots and the clicking of cameras. Then came the first unmistakable sign. Near the base of the wall, half buried under dust, lay a shoe. Its leather was cracked and shriveled, the laces long gone, but the size left no doubt. It belonged to a teenager. Another lay beside it, mismatched in color, as if two people had lost their shoes in the same desperate moment. Investigators pressed forward. On the far side of the chamber, a wooden bench sagged under the weight of time. Resting on it was a small object, its fabric discolored, its ears torn but recognizable. A stuffed rabbit, Dana's stuffed rabbit. The same toy she had carried to school, the same one witnesses remembered clutched in her arms on the night she entered the theater. Its presence was undeniable. The room had not been empty. Along the walls, more artifacts surfaced. A cracked Polaroid camera with its lens shattered. A thermos, its paint chipped, still sealed. Scraps of paper so badly faded that the ink had bled into illegibility. Each piece was bagged carefully, treated like holy relics. The families watching from outside the barricades could only weep, their faces illuminated by the glow of floodlights. Then the searchers found what no one wanted to see, but everyone expected. Bones. At first, just fragments scattered across the dust, their shape distorted by decades of decay. Then, as the light swept further into the chamber, more emerged. Long bones collapsed against the wall, the curve of a ribcage, the unmistakable outline of a skull. Not one, but three. The chamber had become a tomb. The scene was documented in silence. Investigators crouched, photographed, measured, and carefully placed each fragment into evidence bags. Forensic specialists whispered to one another, their voices low, almost reverent. Reporters were kept back, but word spread quickly. Within hours, headlines across the country declared it. Remains found in theater, where teens vanished in 1988. What unsettled everyone most was not just the discovery of the remains, but the condition of the chamber itself. The door had been sealed from the outside, concrete poured thick and deliberate, as if someone had wanted the room erased. Inside, there were no tools, no means of escape. Whoever had been within had no chance of leaving. Families collapsed under the weight of the revelation. Dana's brother screamed into the night, his voice breaking as he shouted, "They were here all this time! They were right here!" Brian's mother wept openly, her body shaking as reporters tried to shield their cameras. Mark's father said nothing, only staring at the ground, as if refusing to meet the reality. Forensic teams worked for days, carefully recovering every fragment. The stuffed rabbit was preserved, its image broadcast on national news. The Polaroid camera, Its film fused into useless lumps became another symbol. Experts promised DNA testing, though everyone knew the results already. Still, the most haunting question lingered. How had the three ended up in the chamber? Witnesses swore they had only gone to watch a film. Rumors suggested they planned to explore, to sneak behind the screen. But even if they had, who sealed them in? And why had no search in 1988 uncovered the hollow space that now lay revealed? Theories reignited overnight. Some believed it had been a tragic accident, that renovations in the theater had unknowingly trapped the teenagers inside. Others were not convinced. The precision of the seal, the deliberate way the hinges had been covered, suggested intent. It looked less like an accident and more like a burial. For Fairview, the discovery did not end the story. It only deepened the unease that had lingered for 3 decades. The Grandview had not swallowed the teenagers into legend. It had held them, silently, waiting for the day when the walls would finally break open. And as investigators carried the remains out under the glare of floodlights, one question spread like wildfire through the crowd gathered on Main Street. If the door was sealed from the outside, then who had sealed it, and why? News of the discovery spread faster than anyone in Fairview could have imagined. Within hours of the first bones being carried out of the Grandview Theater, satellite trucks filled Main Street, their dishes pointed skyward. Reporters crowded the barricades, jostling for position, shouting questions at investigators who refused to answer. The story that had haunted the town for 31 years was no longer just local legend. It was a national headline, broadcast into living rooms across the country. For Fairview residents, the sight was surreal. The theater they had avoided for decades was now lit up brighter than it had ever been in its prime. Floodlights burned through the night, casting long shadows across the empty storefronts. Crowds gathered at the edges of the fencing, whispering in disbelief as men and women in protective suits moved in and out of the chamber behind the screen. Families of the missing were escorted past the barricades, shielded from cameras. Their grief was laid bare nonetheless. Dana's brother lashed out at reporters, shouting that the truth had been there all along and accusing the town of ignoring his family's pleas. Brian's mother collapsed into the arms of a neighbor, repeating through sobs that she had always known her son had never left Fairview. Mark's father stood apart, his face unreadable, as though the weight of 3 decades had left him beyond tears. Authorities held a press conference the following morning. Standing at a podium under the glare of cameras, the county sheriff read a prepared statement. Human remains have been recovered from a concealed chamber within the Grandview Theater. At this time, evidence strongly suggests these remains belong to Mark Ellison, Brian Kelly, and Dana Harper, who disappeared in 1988. We extend our deepest condolences to the families. The investigation remains ongoing. Questions erupted immediately. How had the chamber gone undiscovered during the initial searches? Why was the door sealed from the outside? Who had access to the building at the time? The sheriff dodged each inquiry, repeating only that the investigation was active. His eyes betrayed something his words did not: uncertainty and perhaps fear. Speculation surged. Television pundits dissected every possibility. Some insisted the teenagers had accidentally wandered into the chamber during renovations and been trapped. Others pointed out that the concrete seal appeared deliberate, poured with care, as if someone had wanted to erase the space completely. True crime forums exploded with theories, some grounded in architectural analysis, others drifting into the macabre. Fairview itself fractured under the weight of attention. For some, the discovery was relief. The mystery finally had an ending, however tragic. For others, it was a fresh wound, proof that the nightmare had been avoidable all along. Residents who had grown up under the shadow of the Grandview now found themselves asked by reporters what they remembered, what they believed. Each answer differed, colored by decades of rumor and fear. The chamber's contents were cataloged meticulously. The stuffed rabbit, the Polaroid camera, the shoes, each piece photographed and sealed away. Experts promised DNA testing would confirm identities, though no one doubted. What unsettled most was not confirmation, but the implications. The room was sealed. The teenagers had not escaped, and someone, at some point, had made sure of that. As crews dismantled the last of the wall, journalists captured haunting images, the rusted door frame standing open, the chamber yawning dark behind it. It became the defining photograph of the case, plastered on front pages under headlines like "Sealed Room Reveals Theater's Secret." And, 3 decades later, Fairview learns the truth. But for those who had lived the story, the photograph did not tell the truth. It only deepened the questions. At night, when the crowds dispersed and the floodlights dimmed, the theater loomed darker than ever, its broken windows staring like hollow eyes. Some swore the air smelled different now, heavier, as if the building itself exhaled after holding its secret for so long. Others whispered that the discovery was not an ending, but a beginning, that the hardest answers still lay ahead, because even as the remains were carried away, even as evidence was cataloged, one fact refused to let go. The chamber had been sealed from the outside. Someone had closed that door. Someone had poured that concrete. And in all the noise of reporters and officials, no one could explain who or why. The weeks after the discovery were some of the strangest Fairview had ever known. For more than 30 years, the disappearance of Mark, Brian, and Dana had been a wound wrapped in silence. Now the silence was broken, but the noise that replaced it was no comfort. Reporters flooded the town, setting up in diners, interviewing neighbors, pressing for details that many no longer remembered clearly. News crews filmed outside the ruins of the Grandview Theater, their voices echoing through the hollow shell of a building that had once defined the town's weekends. The families of the 3 teenagers found themselves thrust into a spotlight they had long dreaded. They had begged for answers for decades, but when those answers finally came, they brought no peace. Dana's brother admitted to a journalist, his voice hoarse, "I thought finding them would help. I thought it would make me sleep again. But it's worse, because now I know they were here, and someone put them there." Brian's mother appeared at a vigil, clutching her son's yearbook photo against her chest, saying only, "They never had a chance." Mark's father refused all interviews, his silence interpreted as resignation, though those close to him whispered he had simply run out of words after 31 years. Investigators tried to frame the discovery as closure. At press conferences, officials repeated the same lines. "The remains have been recovered. DNA confirmation is underway. The case is now entering a new phase." But what they avoided saying was what everyone already knew, that the new phase was more unsettling than the last. Closure requires answers, and all the discovery had done was reopen questions. Architectural experts were brought in to examine the chamber. Their reports noted details that raised even more alarms. The walls were poured with reinforced concrete, far stronger than typical partitions of the era. The hinges of the door were rusted but intact, their placement suggesting the door had been functional for years before it was buried under concrete. Whoever sealed it had done so carefully, deliberately, with intent to ensure it would never open again. It was not the work of a storm or an accident, or even hurried renovation. It was deliberate erasure. Theories erupted like wildfire. Some commentators speculated that construction crews in the late 1980s might have accidentally trapped the teenagers while sealing unused rooms, unaware they were inside. But that explanation unraveled quickly. The seal was too precise, the concrete too thick. Others suggested a far darker scenario, that someone had lured the 3 into the chamber and sealed them in. A person with keys, access, and knowledge of the building. A person who had vanished just as cleanly as the teenagers themselves. True crime programs devoted entire episodes to dissecting the case. Podcasts played audio from old interviews, piecing together timelines. Online forums swelled with debate, poring over photographs of the chamber, debating whether marks on the interior walls indicated attempts to escape. Some swore they saw scratches on the concrete near the floor, as if fingernails had clawed at the surface. Officials refused to comment. Fairview itself became divided. Some residents welcomed the attention, believing it might finally bring answers. Others despised it, feeling their town had been reduced to a backdrop for strangers' entertainment. Tension filled council meetings, where residents demanded the ruins be demolished completely, erased from the town's map. Others argued the site should be preserved as a memorial. No consensus came. And through it all, the families waited. DNA results returned within weeks, confirming what no one doubted. The remains belonged to Mark Ellison, Brian Kelly, and Dana Harper. The announcement was delivered in a sterile press release, a few paragraphs meant to close a file. But for those who had lived under the shadow of the Grandview, it was not closure. It was confirmation of their worst fears, that the children had been trapped in the place everyone had walked past for decades, begging for answers that were right there, sealed behind concrete. Fairview had wanted truth. What it received was something heavier: proof without explanation, discovery without understanding. The town was left to wrestle not with a mystery solved, but with a mystery sharpened. The national attention that followed the discovery transformed Fairview almost overnight. Journalists dug into archives, unearthing old blueprints, faded photographs of the Grandview Theater in its prime, and testimonies from employees long since retired. Each article carried the same haunting theme. The mystery had not been solved. It had only deepened. Investigative reporters traced ownership records of the building. They discovered that in the late 1980s, during the very year the teenagers disappeared, renovations had indeed been scheduled. Contractors were hired, permits were filed, but the records stopped abruptly. No detailed logs of what work had been completed survived. No clear explanation of why the project had been abandoned. It was as if a portion of history had been quietly erased, leaving only gaps. For some, that silence became its own kind of evidence. Attention turned toward Harold Bennett, the theater's owner. By 2019, he was long dead, but his name resurfaced in headlines. Neighbors described him as eccentric, secretive, a man who cared more for the building than for the people who filled it. Former employees recalled odd instructions, entire wings of the basement off limits, warnings never to tamper with certain doors. One usher swore that Bennett had a ring of keys he never allowed out of his sight, keys that opened spaces no one else had ever seen. Police fielded new calls, many from people who admitted they had been too afraid to speak in 1988. A woman confessed she once heard screaming near the theater late at night, but assumed it was teenagers playing a prank. A former janitor admitted he believed there was a hidden stairwell behind the projection booth, though he could never prove it. These recollections, decades late, were impossible to verify, but they poured gasoline on the fire of speculation. Television networks produced specials with ominous titles. The Theater Tomb, Vanished in the Grandview. Dramatizations showed actors in vintage clothes running through shadowed hallways, their flashlights trembling as they discovered bricked walls. Each program ended with the same chilling image: the rusted door, sealed from the outside, a silent testament to something no one could explain. For the families, the spectacle was unbearable. They wanted answers, not dramatizations. Dana's brother publicly condemned the programs, calling them exploitation. Brian's mother refused interviews altogether, her grief renewed with every broadcast. Mark's father appeared once, in a short segment, where he said simply, "They're gone, and I'll die never knowing why." His words silenced the room more effectively than any analysis. Still, the public fascination grew. Online forums charted every theory, from plausible to unthinkable. Some users built detailed 3D models of the Grandview, overlaying them with notes from eyewitnesses. Others scoured property records, searching for missing contractors, unexplained financial transactions, anything that might suggest foul play. A few insisted the chamber had been constructed deliberately as a trap, a place intended for more than just the three who vanished. Amid the noise, one detail resurfaced that unsettled even hardened investigators. The chamber showed no evidence of utilities, no ventilation, no wiring, nothing to suggest it had ever been intended as part of the theater's design. And yet, the walls were smooth, the construction deliberate, as though someone had built a room whose only purpose was to be sealed. Theories swirled darker than ever. Was it possible the teenagers had stumbled into something larger? A crime? A secret hidden within the Grandview's walls? Or had the building itself been shaped by someone who intended it to hide bodies all along? With no surviving suspects, no witnesses who could be trusted after so many years, the case remained suspended in shadow. Fairview, once again, became synonymous with its theater. Tourists stopped to take photographs of the ruins. Podcasters recorded episodes from the sidewalks. The town's identity, once tied to cornfields and factories, was now forever linked to a single night in 1988 and the secret that its walls had kept sealed for more than 3 decades. For the families, the attention was salt in a wound that had never healed. They wanted justice, but justice requires truth. And all they had were bones, artifacts, and a door sealed shut from the outside. The discovery had answered one question: where the children had gone. But it left the more haunting question untouched: who had put them there, and why? The months that followed the discovery brought a strange stillness back to Fairview, though it was not the silence of ignorance anymore. It was the silence of knowing just enough to be haunted forever. The Grandview Theater was reduced to rubble, the chamber behind its screen dismantled piece by piece, but its absence only deepened the unease. Where a building once stood, there was now only an empty lot surrounded by chain-link fencing. At night, the glow of street lamps cast shadows across the dirt, and people swore it felt heavier than when the theater itself had loomed there. The county debated what to do with the land. Some argued it should be rebuilt, turned into something new so the town could move forward. Others demanded it remain empty, a scar preserved in plain sight. The families asked only that a memorial be placed, something quiet, something that acknowledged not only the 3 names, but the decades of silence that followed. A simple plaque was eventually installed at the edge of the lot, but for many, it felt hollow. Words on metal could never contain the weight of what had been lost. Fairview changed in subtle ways. The diner on the corner, once filled with laughter, became quieter, its walls decorated with newspaper clippings about the case. The high school dedicated a page in its yearbook to the 3 teenagers every year. Younger children, who had not been alive in 1988, still grew up with the story, passed down like a warning. The Grandview became not just history, but identity. Everyone in Fairview lived under its shadow, whether they wanted to or not. Investigators released their final report in late 2020. The conclusion was unsatisfying. The remains had been recovered, the identities confirmed, but the cause of death undetermined. There was no evidence of foul play, they wrote, though the sealed chamber strongly suggested human involvement. The report closed with a single line that infuriated the families: "This case is considered resolved." For the parents, siblings, and friends, It was anything but resolved. Dana's brother gave interviews condemning the statement, insisting the town had chosen convenience over truth. Brian's mother wept on television, holding her son's photograph. Mark's father never spoke publicly again, his silence heavier than any words. Fairview slipped back into obscurity, but the story never truly left. Documentaries revisited it, podcasts dissected it. Every few months, a new article appeared online, repeating the same haunting phrases. Sealed room, vanished teens, the theater that swallowed 3. The questions remained. Why had no one found the chamber in 1988? Who sealed the door? And was it an accident or something else? Theories continue even now. Some insist the chamber was part of an unfinished renovation, sealed without realizing 3 teenagers were inside. Others are certain it was deliberate, that someone with keys and access trapped them there, covering their crime with concrete. The lack of evidence leaves space for both possibilities, and that uncertainty is what keeps the case alive. Fairview learned to live with that uncertainty, though it never stopped weighing on those who called the town home. The empty lot remains fenced, weeds sprouting where the theater once stood. Visitors still stop to peer through the gaps, whispering as if the ground itself holds secrets. At night, the silence of that block feels different than the rest of town, as though it listens. For the families, closure never came. Answers never arrived. Time passed, decades shifted, generations changed, but the loss remained a wound that never healed. The discovery in 2019 gave them bones, belongings, proof. But proof is not truth. Truth was locked behind the sealed door, and whoever closed it left with the key. And so the story of the Grandview Theater lingers, not just in Fairview, but far beyond it. A story of 3 teenagers who walked into the ordinary and vanished into the impossible. A story of silence that lasted 31 years, only to break open into more silence. The lot where the Grandview once stood is quiet now. But sometimes, on windless nights, when the air hangs heavy, people say they can almost hear the echo of laughter. 3 voices drifting just out of reach, forever trapped in the shadow of a door that should never have been sealed.